Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unlocking Cannabis. My name is Jordan Euclid. I'll be your host today, and I am very lucky to be joined by Justin Fischer today, the CEO and founder of RiskScout. Justin, thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jordan.
Absolutely. So why don't we just get things kicked off? Would love to just hear a little bit about your background and your career path before you got into the cannabis industry.
Yeah, so I'm a Texas native. I'm here in Austin, Texas. Funny side story. I always thought I was going to be an attorney. We kind of in our household held debating at a high level, and logic, and I thought I would do that. So ended up essentially, setting up everything for pre-law at UT, and in the process, I worked basically a co-work program in my senior year for an Oracle database company. And here I was a 17, 18-year-old kid, and they were like, well, look, you've kind of fixed everything from IT. Why don't you go sit in the classes? And so all of a sudden I'm being exposed to this high level database stuff. People are paying $1,500 a day at this class. And all of a sudden I find myself, out at some of their client sites, and I'm building websites and doing all kinds of crazy stuff in the late 90s. So quickly for me, my story kind of parallels with Austin growing up as a tech hub, right?
Sure.
And ended up at UT in computer science, and then very quickly with Austin Ventures and a bunch of, started a company at 19. So essentially it just blew out right there to technology. Didn't realize that sci-fi nerd in me, really wanted to come out, and learn new things and solve problems.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then, Elon Musk made his way down there. So, you're setting the trend.
Yeah. No, it's crazy now, man. I mean, the great thing about me, I helped to build a big fintech company here, which is Texas's largest IPO in the last 20 years.
Sure.
And I hired 140 people in 2.5 years, from 2010 to our final IPO was in 2014. But we were at $5 million of revenue company. We went to 250 million in revenue when we went public. They now have, and we were 600 employees at that time. They now have 1,800 employees, named the MLS stadium. It's nuts, but in that scale world, it was from, you get that hockey stick going with sales, and they're just, they were delivering this. We were doing online banking, and they're finally getting parity with the market, and everybody's going after them. Now all of a sudden you've got hundreds of banks, and my team had to deliver all that work. And
right.
So scaling all that was kind of crazy. The interesting thing about it is there's not a lot of fintechs in Austin. I mean, it's growing, but I find a lot of entrepreneurs that move here, they end up deciding if you're really going to start a company and you're in a high growth, they almost essentially move back out. They'll go to Denver, or they'll go to, actually just here in North Carolina is another hub, but go to a place where you can get more resources, because here you're fighting Elon and Oracle and,
Sure.
a bunch of other things. So, but the great thing for me is I've got a great network here. So it's kind of, people always ask me why won't you leave Austin? There's so many other opportunities. I mean, I worked in South Africa for a while, but it's kind of the Kevin Bacon, but 0.5 degrees. You have a good reputation. Everybody knows you. I'm that's the fintech guy, right? And go ask him, and you get to get involved in all these things. And the town is so compact that 20 minutes to get that downtown and you're all around. Whereas, even Houston or Dallas, which have pretty good tech hubs, but they're sprawl everywhere. So to do a developer meetup or something, you're going, almost an hour and a half across town. So it's just, it's a great space, lots of opportunity, kind of dense, smaller city,
Yep. It's funny. I found the exact same dynamics living in Denver. I came from the Bay Area before this as well. And I think both Austin and Denver have a lot of the same dynamics, right? It attracts similar type of people, obviously not quite as expensive as living in the Bay, although certainly both cities are getting close to it.
Going up. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And so Justin, after the last business IPO, and can you remind me the name of that business?
Q2
Q2, great.
QTWO, this is the symbol.
Got it. And so then what did your progression look like after that took place? Did you decide to jump right into the cannabis industry from there, or what were kind of next steps?
Yeah, man. So I'll go back a sec. 20 years been working in technology. I was a CTO for half my career, right? And really, I'm a product guy. I've never been the algorithmic heavy developer, but I love to build, and so that was the way to build, right? Then I went into operations, and then obviously it's a couple of the other C titles, but really always about this kind of efficiency world. Well, the last 18 of those 20 years, really the bulk of my career were with community banks through the CRM that we did before Q2. And then what happens is I've got kind of a unique perspective where, because of our scale, I've been in thousands and thousands of banks operation centers, right? I've been shoulder to shoulder on many Memorial Day weekends, helping them go through massive conversions on their systems. I mean, I helped a handful of banks in Kansas negotiate a buyback from Bank of America, right, for their local branch. So I've been in a lot of those kind of situations. And, one of the things you find out about community banks, 8,000 community banks and credit unions, right?
Wow.
So they're like 98% of the banking. Yeah. And in any other country, it doesn't work like that, right? There's bigger money center banks and that's all they've got. But you've got all these essentially small mom and pop banks, anywhere from a couple branches at the low end to, the meat of them have about, 10 to 15 branches. You'll know them, local credit union or bank. But what essentially happens is they have a single BSA officer. And it's actually very similar to the cybersecurity problem. There's a much bigger demand on regulatory space. And you've got this person who, at the best case, is sort of in their 30s, late 30s or 40s, but most of them are close to retirement. And they've been manually doing things to track compliance. And then, all these new markets start to come out, or the necessity to move from a traditional tourism or community market to a hemp market that's opening up, or a cannabis market right in your space. Of course, your CEO just goes, do it. And now you've got to deal with, how do I do this? It's two problems. I don't know what I don't know. And there's a lot of overhead, and they're both true. You should learn the process. It's not a complete tools and software solution. And then you should try to scale it, because if you start to do any program of any size, you're going to fall over, and then the examiner is going to come in, and that's where you're really going to fall over. You're going to get an enforcement action, and you're going to be in trouble. It affects the entire bank and what the bank can do. So we, working in these things, I started to spot this additional sort of issue. So I was mostly working with operations teams before. Now I'm starting to see compliance officers. And one of my big partners, big fintech company who wouldn't touch cannabis, said, "Hey, we've got a lot of banks, and on the West Coast, this was a couple of years ago, they had 18 people in a room. There were temps, and banks don't generally hire temps for the due diligence work. But this looked like the old late 80s, 90s mortgage offices where they're going through paperwork stacks like this to try to go through mortgages and such." And you know how mortgages change, right? In the last 20 years, basically you can do them on your phone, right? Well, compliance hasn't changed. So they were just going through these massive stacks. Well, on the other side of that customer is bringing in millions of dollars of deposits, and they're paying $5,000 a month for a DDA account. You or I would balk at paying $5 a month, right?
Yeah.
$5,000 a month. And so they said, "Hey, this is a software problem. You could really automate a lot of this work." Meanwhile, existing BSA software is all very back office and very was developed 20 years ago. So it's I mean, you can even see the interfaces. You'll see this old .NET and old like green screen interfaces on some of these things, and you're like, okay. But what we started to see the issue is that compliance has changed. And I'll give you the best example I think most people can relate to, right? And cannabis is forcing a lot of this change. So this is how it kind of ties together. Capital One. Don't care for the bank, but I have a Capital One credit card, right? If I take my wife out to dinner and I put a 25% tip, and someone changes that to 125%, Capital One sends me a text. I'll probably get that text before I even get home, and it'll say, "Did you mean to do this?" And I'll say, "No." That's essentially compliance and due diligence, and they take care of everything, right? Automatic, straight to my fingertips. And to the newer generation, that might seem as a normal thing. But then you look at like Chase, and I've got an SWA Chase card. And if I have that transaction happen, a week later, I'll find it on my statement. And then I'll end up having to call the call center, go through this horrible process. And then you know what they do? "Hey, we canceled your card for you. We'll send you another one in 7 days." And you're like, "What? No, I can't operate." Like, especially if you're, I don't know how much you travel, but you're traveling and now you have a card that's dead, right?
You got all these subscriptions that are attached to it as well.
So that latter example, Chase, is like current BSA systems. Whereas what we did with RiskScout, or what we saw in the problem domain, especially with cannabis, is people want to apply online. They want to quickly understand what the compliance requirements are. They totally will do compliance, but they want to do it and not be a day job. So
Justin, can you just quickly explain what BSA system means?
Yeah, Bank Secrecy Act is the acronym that basically is compliance and due diligence inside the bank. And they're required to take a reasonable effort or to follow the regulations to make sure you're not money laundering or criminal activity. And the problem that we all have right now in this space is that the Safe Banking Act, it's federally legal. And so really the federal agencies, there's a bunch of different acronyms that govern banks, haven't established regs. If you walk in to get a bank account tomorrow and they didn't send you a paper statement, and they just sent you electronic, again, you'd probably be like, hey, that's cool. But that's actually against the reg. If they don't get acknowledgement, a active acknowledgement from you, that's against a reg. There's a reg for that, but there's no reg for cannabis banking, right?
Right.
And so there's this problem where, okay, then what do I do? What's reasonable? And then one company's definition or bank's definition of reasonable can be wildly different than another. Like I know, one bank is basically, showing up every other week at their dispensaries, right? Another does them every quarter, every 6 months on-site reviews, right? So it's a wild west of like what's reasonable. And it all comes down to that guy that's going to come in or lady that's going to come in and look over your shoulder and decide whether or not you're taking reasonable actions to prevent cartel and money laundering and human trafficking.
Yeah. So that's what the banks are looking at when they come in and do the physical examination.
They're really looking to see, first of all, they're looking to see what kind of competency you have, right?
Okay.
So here's a really important thing. I do this presentation to a lot of the Texas hemp and different state hemp organizations on the hemp side, some of the cannabis side, but it's entitled, Your Bank Doesn't Hate You. And it's an important concept. They don't understand you. So if you're getting kicked out, it's because they don't understand your business and they don't have the capability to manage it, right? Sure. That's the issue. It's not that you're automatically guilty and illegal of something. They just don't understand you. But the problem is because of that, what we've now had is a bunch of businesses who apply for merchant processing, for banking, who obscure everything, right? They don't share what they're doing fully. And then the bank comes in and goes, well, wait a minute, you said you weren't plant touching, but isn't that a bunch of plant and seed basically sitting there? Oh no, yeah, but it's seed. Yeah, but by definition, that's plant touching, right? Plant. So yeah, so what really the core of it is they're going to look for a lot of things like security and how you're managing your operation. They really want to see you have a mind for compliance, right? Just like an OSHA inspector would come in and see, is there stuff happening that's unsafe? Like, are you doing this? Are you having restricted areas? Are you preventing selling to children? What are the different things that we can make sure you're doing?
Yeah.
And then they can say reasonably that they went and they visited. But I'll tell you, they're also learning. They're trying to understand how these dispensaries and processing works, right?
Sure.
And so that's a big part of it. And so the pullback for a second here is find a good bank partner first and foremost. Be completely honest and disclose what you do, and you'll be in the best relationship you can be. You won't. I mean, you always have a chance that they could kick you out for something, right? That can happen. But for the most part, they don't want to. They want to manage you as a community business, and they want to get that cash into the bank, and they want to manage that. And that's the story, right? So you can find a good partner, and then really go all in with that partner.
That makes sense. So on that front, Justin, would love to learn a little bit more about your story as an entrepreneur. How you made the decision to dive in and start RiskScout, and what the process has been like scaling that business.
Yeah, I guess I never really knew any better. I've always been an entrepreneur, right? So always, we started a company in 2001 before cloud, man. I'm telling you, with cloud, everything is so much better, especially if you're a software company. But we were rating self-storage units, and people were literally pushing their tchotchkes to us while we were taking their servers to be able to run software companies, right?
Yeah.
But to me, I always like the latitude of listening directly to the customer's issue and being able to solve that customer's issue and being in control of that destiny. I think there's nothing wrong with the bigger company, and I've been in many public companies and larger companies, but you just start getting to be where you wake up every day, and in order to do your work, that 1 hour of the 8-hour days is probably the only effective hour you have. The rest of it is, shaking hands and kissing babies and doing politics and things like that. And I'm also a team guy. I like to tell my team and work with the team and be, that solid base and of integrity for them. And sometimes, HR processes and things things just get in the way, red tape. And so to me, I like to move fast, like to build. And I've been very fortunate to have a good network. I've had good investors who followed on multiple times, and I know a lot about this space. So, it is not easy. I mean, banks take a while to make decisions. New technology is new technology, but the kind of customers and the kind of things we're doing, when we have a bank, let me tell you a quick story. So we have a bank, North Carolina. They were doing 5 businesses walking through a branch, right? In February of 2020, had no idea. No one had any idea what happened at this point, right? I remember I was actually in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was trying to find masks because that was the thing in February. Okay, do we need masks now? And they had 5 hemp customers come in, 2 branches, very small institution. It took 12 weeks for them to open up a hemp count, right? And it was all this due diligence and back and forth, all very manual. Well, they closed their branches. Their branches are still closed, right? Like a lot of banks across the country. And they have no other online account opening or other options. They have to do everything by the phone. We launched RiskScout with them, which is an onboarding, business verification, compliance. And they're doing, like in April, 100 apps a month. Nationally, they've got all of the markets covered, and they're doing them in 2 days, right? Wow. And then they're even able to send a merchant account application right after the main DDA one straight through RiskScout and get that one done in a couple of days. So in the course of a week, I can get you with the DDA and the CBD merchant account processing like that, right? Decisions, compliance checked, verified, all of it. And so that's the difference. And you know, a lot of institutions are in their spot where their existing markets are, are starting to have challenges through the pandemic. So how do they open up to these emerging markets, right? Mm-hmm. And so fortunately for all of us in the cannabis space, they want to, but it's a matter of really understanding, how to deal with the regulatory space, and then how to deal with the overhead.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a very sharp learning curve, and I would love to learn a little bit more about, what is that process like for banks that, want to get into cannabis, are, curious about it, clearly see an interesting market there, but, don't know about the process. I mean, what's a good first step? Where can they find educational materials? How would they go through that process?
It's a great question. So there are starting to be increased information sessions in places. We're actually teaching a lot at the banking associations. We teach the FFIEC, which is the main governing body in compliance. So we're all over the place. There's always some free webinars on our page, but aside from us, the best thing you can do is get into common groups with your compliance officers, and they usually do. Their compliance officers will go to the same events, and we'll be out at ACANS, for example. It's a huge compliance conference out in Vegas in September. Mm-hmm. That's where you're going to start hearing best practices, and banks do talk to each other about this. I mean, even in the same market, right? They want to share these things, and they don't, they want to learn from each other. So I think that's a really great way, is to seek your peers out. Look for companies who don't just try to sell you software, which is a few. Look for people who are really going to help take you through the process. I get a ton more. I mean, I get about 15x more traffic since the Senate confirmations in January, because a lot of banks are like moving towards, hey, something's going to happen here. Safe banking, decrim, something is going to codify this, right? But let's pull back for a second. Without a federal mandate, you really have to be obviously in a state that's legal. Or have jurisdiction in a state that's legal, and you've got to be very clear about your banking program for that state. So if you're chartered where you can do Illinois, but you're in North Carolina, you need to be very explicit about how you're banking, because you're going to have different regulators coming at you, right? But yeah, and again, like the fail safe here is, if you want to drop out to RiskScout.com, we have a lot of information out there, and we have a compliance dream team. We have an OCC regulator, starts next week, but our system has OCC regulators, BSA officers, and one BSA officer who came from like the money center banks. So, we're happy to, lend insight and share ideas. But the overall arching problem we all have is, it's what is reasonable for your institution and your examiner who's going to ultimately grade you, right? So that's the key.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And a couple questions on of follow-ups on that last point. So number one, what do the typical examiners of these banks, state chartered banks and credit unions look like? Because, I'm from my personal past life, I'm used to kind of the SIFI kind of federally regulated banks. So I'm curious, what the examination process looks like for your typical clientele.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different types of examinations, right? Safety and sound and various ones. And so the state bank auditors and examiners are going to be very similar to federal auditors and examiners. They have a playbook. In fact, actually, last month we were talking to the FFIEC about their ATM playbook. We do more than just cannabis. We do ATM, MSPs, lots of other workflows. And so we found a bunch of inconsistencies about regarding how they tell the examiner to do the exam. So that results in, like, we had a bank who had a customer for 25 years who was managing their own ATMs, right? This is non-bank ATMs. It's just a guy who owns 300 ATMs. Well, the examiner comes in and says, you have to have a DDA account for every ATM. And that's ludicrous. I mean, that's way too much overhead. The bank pushed back, but the examiner pushed more, and they had to let the customer go. Does that sound familiar? Like anything we hear about in the cannabis world? So ATMs have been around for a long time. MSPs have been around for a long time, money service businesses. So these businesses are highly regulated. There are regs, but there's still, clarity problems with the examiners. So we got on the phone with a bunch of the head regulators, and they're like, look, that's not our intention. No, that should not be the case. We're like,
Yeah.
look, here's the problem. Now that BSA officer, they're going to go share their experience. And every other BSA officer you talk to is going to go, oh, I'm not going to touch ATMs with the 10-foot pole.
Right.
That's going to happen and is happening with cannabis as well, right? They see an enforcement action, which just happened with a small credit union recently, right? They see these things happen and they go, oh, that just confirms I don't want to deal with this. And then shuts down yet another opportunity to bank this community, right? So it's a real challenge when there's discrepancies in the way that these things are examined, right?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And so then you'd also mentioned, the Safe Banking Act. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you think, if and when the Safe Banking Act passes, or be it something like the Schumer bill, which has broader provisions, how do you expect that's going to change the landscape for banks looking to serve the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I only crack a smile here because almost we're starting an investment process, and almost every investor I talk to is like, you don't have a business after the Safe Banking Act comes through. And it's like, yeah, I get where you're coming from. But one of my statements is this, and this is how I say it. When you can walk into Walgreens or the grocery store and you can buy your pot using an ID, essentially equivalent to alcohol, then to me, it'll be commoditized. You will not see the same issues you do. Now, again, ATMs and MSBs are totally legal. They've been out there forever, but they still have issues, right? And they're still, the regulatory problems are even worse now, right? You could argue, things like mortgage, was fine. Like 2000, I could get a mortgage really easy. 2006 changed a lot of that. Things change, right?
Right.
But my take is what I just described, that future state is probably 8 to 10 years away, right? Even with a legalization in a couple of years. I believe that we'll get some type of regulatory sphere, and then states. I think Texas is kind of in the spot where they don't want to do it, but you can drive to Oklahoma, Louisiana, New Mexico, so it's same with gambling, right? Now we're looking at gambling resorts because it's like people are just going to do it anyway. So totally. I think they're going to not want to miss out on the revenue. So I think there will be a big push, and I think we'll see legalization very similar to what happened in hemp, where it's federally, but states make their own rules to it. Right. I think we'll see that in a couple of years. The hope is that we can get Safe Banking Act before that, because I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of the provisions, but right, cannabis businesses can't take certain tax deductions, can't take really any tax deductions, right? You've got, all these problems with the cash. You got problems with interstate, transit. You've got banks who are doing this, who have no protection from the DOJ. So there's no recs. There's really nothing but the Cole memo, which was, essentially rescinded. So there's really very, very little in terms of, spelling out how this should work. And no one really wants that. But the problem, obviously, you're seeing, just as of the last few weeks, to reintroduce the decrim legalization bill, because a lot of people in our Congress believe that the Safe Banking Act would placate and delay further legalization. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's not. All I can tell you is we need something sooner. And if it's going to take us several years to pass legalization at a federal level, then we're going to be in this weird backwash for a while, right?
Right.
But to answer your question, I think in the near term, I've already seen it. Banks are getting off the sidelines, knowing that this is happening. So that's good for all of us. It's good for our business, good for cannabis businesses. So they're all moving towards that, that early adopter curve. They're moving to that mid part of the curve. And I think what you'll see is if it legalizes or decrims, you won't see the regulations go away, but you'll see a more clear signal on what to do. And you'll see the banks just all come to the table. Not all come to the table. You'll have your holdouts and your people who have moral objections or whatever. Sure. It is technically still a vice, no matter legalization or not. So you'll have those, but you'll see, there's about 100 banks, I think right now, banks and credit unions doing it. I think you'll see that jump to several thousand in the next couple of years.
That's great. That's great. And, some banks that we've spoken with will only work with what are called tier 2 and tier 3 customers, which, for folks outside the industry, that typically means ancillary businesses that don't necessarily sell cannabis themselves, but generate the majority of the revenues from customers who do. Those customers being the tier 1 plant touching businesses that need to own licenses to operate, like cultivators, dispensaries, distributors, and the like. And so I'm curious just to know, what are you seeing with your clients? Are more and more of them, working with both tier 1 and tier 2s? What are some of the differences and similarities between, banking those types of customers?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is we see all the markets, right? So THC we treat separately than hemp and CBD, right?
Mhm.
For obvious reasons. And there's several thousand banks already doing hemp and CBD in some form or fashion, mostly like dipping a toe in the water. But, in Texas, we have 1,500 licenses now in hemp. I had banks a year ago saying, I'm not touching it, to now, okay, this is my big high net customer who's deciding to do this. What do I do? Right. So
Yeah.
it changes a lot when it's in your backyard. But, one of the things is you got to treat these things differently. Right. And to your point, you also have types of customers. You also, on the hemp side, have cultivators and processors and, dispensaries, essentially, transports, you've got testers, you've got all that world. And so the banks are very fluent with that. The ones we work with really identify that. And they, one of the unique things about our software is you can configure those workflows. So we have banks who say, look, they'll use RiskScout, and then they'll say, in Texas, just CBD and no CBD retailers. I just want processors and wholesalers in the center, right? That's all I want. And then might even say, look, I want people who are not just getting started. I want people who've been established. And they'll build those workflows, from both an underwriting on compliance, but also an underwriting on economic value, right? I mean, more power to the dude who's doing, his own, pre-rolls in his basement. But
Mhm.
generally, that's going to be a challenge for most banks, right? Especially community banks and credit unions. So they're really looking for, just like any bank, like, is this going to be a, profitable customer for all the work that I'm going to end up doing for that market? And
Mhm.
so, and loans, and we can talk all about that later, but loans and insurance and other products are just not quite out there yet because of other reasons. But to answer your question, there's definitely different workflows. We'll see the most questions and documents and requirements at the type 1 level, of course. We'll see more like monthly check-ins through our system that they'll do, quarterly reviews, quarterly on-site inspections. And again, we automate all that. So, but they'll set up a bunch of additional traffic there, in that workflow versus someone who's just transport or someone who's in the, we actually even have a hemp bank who's banking a business who has 100% cannabis. The money comes from cannabis businesses. They do greenhouse lighting. They kill it. They did a great job. But the bank has basically said, look, you're going to essentially be treated like a type 3 or a hemp business, but we do want to regularly know and check how you're doing your due diligence on your customers, because
Mhm.
we it's not our requirement to make sure, but we do want to make sure that you have some general sensibility about not just taking everybody and some dude who's doing his private grow or something like that, right? You're not setting it up in a basement somewhere that's
Yeah.
highly illegal. So those are just general course good business things. Just like saying, hey, Jordan, you're taking credit. How are you reviewing people for credit? It's the
Mhm.
same as that, right? The bank wants to see that you're doing a proper process, and you're not going to end up on some law enforcement's list, right?
Totally.
Yeah. So there's definitely different workflows. They apply the different workflows. I mean, we have a Texas bank who banks Texas, and then they bank Colorado. So obviously 2 different workflows. We have them bank California differently than Oregon, and just in THC. Some who just want type 3s, some who just want wholesalers. So the beauty of what we do is, for whatever reason, and this is another business opportunity for any of your listeners who want to work in banking, the online banking account opening for commercial businesses is like almost non-existent. You and
Mhm.
I can go as a person and open an account with almost anybody, right? But opening an account for a business is complicated, and so no one's
Sure.
really tackled that well. There's a couple companies kind of going that direction, but so one unique thing we have is we built all that because we had to ask you all these questions before you get into the account opening process. And the significance of that is if you go to Square today, or you go to some other banks where they just don't ask you a ton of questions up front and they start banking you, you'll have what I get like hammered every day on with people who are getting kicked out. And actually lately Square's been freezing a lot of funds, unfortunately, for people,
Mhm.
and they don't know why. They're like, I didn't do anything wrong. It's like, well, you got caught up in their 90-day review or their 120-day review. And so we really counsel our banks to use these tools up front and filter these business and tell them right away. Maybe even tell them, don't even fill out the rest of the application because you're too adjacent to type 1, or you're doing this. And it saves the bank a ton of time, right? Like I have a bank that sees over 100 apps a month, right? But they only bank about 30 of those, right? They're
Mhm.
about 30%, in terms of what they decide to take on. So that's the difference in what we do. And so it's out in the front, and that way, the business can be quick about, their compliance and what they need to do. And they never, in our system, they never have to come to the branch, right? They can actually, so recently we had a wire monitoring situation, right? And I'm not sure how much your audience knows this, but the banks monitor every transaction, every account, doesn't matter personal or business. And we had $100,000 wire to China. Well, that's suspicious looking, especially for a farmer who doesn't normally do anything outside of
Mhm.
his own state. And so in the old world, in the chase world we described before, the old, like, you know, analog world, they'd have to send that out to the branch. The branch would call the customer in, or it would take a couple of weeks to get an answer of what that wire was about, right? And it's the bank's job to create a case and complete the case, you know, and then they've got to prove that. Well, in our system, they just sent a task out to the customer, and he picked up his phone. You can do this from your phone, and he took a picture of a machine. It was a hemp separator, a bud separator. And he took a picture of the invoice where he had to wire the money to China. And he was like, look, guys, I didn't know that tripped your wires, but it's China. They make machines, and I had to have this machine. And it's all good. And 90% of the time, that's what happens. It's like that simple. But the fact is, the farmer just took a picture. You know, sometimes the banks will say, hey, I want a picture of your updated greenhouse, or I want a picture of your security. And they'll just fire it off and be done. And then that's cool. We have this like motto: the business should not be in our application any longer than they have to be. We don't want them sitting there. They don't have to read news and no, just do the compliance and get out and run your business, right? Yeah. Which is what we heard from all these dispensaries. They're like, I spend 4 or 5 hours every week managing my bank. Why? Right? Why? And they're like, I'm totally thankful to have a bank account, but that's just ridiculous, you know?
Right.
So that's the way we see things. And so we're very much on the front end of the business account opening kind of process, and making sure we qualify that all the way up front before all that work hits the institution. I won't name the name of the bank, but there was a bank in California who had a hemp program, and they opened up a merchant account program publicly. And within 48 hours, they had over 2,000 applications, and they shut it down. It was too scary for them to be able to onboard or even think about that. So we all know the demand's there, but also if that came directly into your backend systems and you opened all those accounts, and then compliance just gets this like stack of businesses that, oh, they don't even have their license. Why did we even sign that account? Oh, they didn't have, you know, this is way out of our threshold, right? We don't do thousands of acres and big type ones, you know, multi-state operator. Like, you know, there's this whole world there, you know? So
yeah, that makes
very much like loan underwriting. I mean, you know, you wouldn't take every loan and then decide later, oh, after we got you to sign all the paperwork, we're not actually going to fund this. Sorry. You know, we want our money back, you know?
That makes sense. And so, you know, I know you talked a little bit about some other industries that aren't cannabis related, but still face a lot of these kind of high regulatory compliance issues, like money services, like ATMs. I'm curious, are there other good case studies of industries that you can point to and say, look, you know, even though this is technically federally legal, it still is very challenging. A lot of banks just don't want to deal with it because of the regulatory hurdles. So I'm curious, are there other examples that you can think of there?
You know what I always told myself, this is one entrepreneurial lesson. If you can start a business, that's great. Obviously, the best is you can solve a problem for people. Even better, you solve a problem for people where everybody's talking about something. There's a lot of wind in the sails. Cannabis, I wore a t-shirt that said 99 problems, but the cash isn't one. And I went to a real like straight-laced banking conference, and you wouldn't believe how much time I basically got tackled every corner, right? So that's fun. Cryptocurrency is a new one, right? And it's one a lot of banks are trying to get their head around. There's obviously this consumer SSO to your wallet kind of thing happening, and a lot of power behind that, which helps the legitimacy for other banks to go, well, I guess it's not all dark web and, you know, human trafficking, right? But you know, there's crazy things happening. These guys that run these ATMs, well, guess what? They're getting challenged in their bodega that they have this ATM at, where this Bitcoin terminal just shows up, and they're like, crap, now I'm battling for currency. So the ATM manufacturers are creating cryptocurrency features, and you know, then the operator's happy, right? Now I'm you know, relevant. And then the bank goes, wait, are you're doing cryptocurrency? No, now you're even worse. You know, you might as well be now putting that into the cannabis dispensaries, and you're doing the trifecta, right? It's the worst case scenario. So yeah, the interesting thing for most high risk is it follows cash. And I was watching CNBC the other day, and they had a cryptocurrency specialist, and they go, okay, so let's talk about money laundering. And, you know, this cryptocurrency allows lots of criminal behavior. And he goes, look, it's possible. Things can happen like that. I mean, all the exchanges are now regulated and reported, but he goes, let me show you something. He opened his briefcase. He goes, picture there's cash in here, because that's the fastest and easiest way to do criminal activity, right? Yeah. I don't know if you're a fan of Ozarks. They're pretty spot on with their money laundering, right? Don't go take that and go do it. You'll get caught, but they're pretty good at describing what you do. And so, you know, the bottom line is ATMs. You know, one of the things we see a lot of cannabis dispensaries do, and people in the cannabis world, is they, in fact, I had a CBD customer ask me the other day. She got to $150 limit on Square, $150,000 limit on Square, and she was like, I can't process anymore. I need an ATM or something, which is totally ridiculous that they would limit you just, you know, arbitrarily. But you do not want to run that ATM, and you don't want to own that ATM and run it in your own dispensary or your bar or anything, because then you create this problem for the bank where the money can easily move between till and between the, you can be feeding the machine, and that is a breeding ground for money laundering. Doesn't mean you're doing it. It just means it's very difficult for the bank to reconcile that. So you do not want to do that. You do not want to run your own ATM. Now, how do you get around that? Well, you contract with a third party. They run it. You have no affiliation. They fill it differently. You do not give them the cash. It's separated, right? It's that simple. But those are the kind of things that exist. But yeah, cryptocurrency, MSBs, ATMs, they're all, well, cryptocurrency is new, just similar to cannabis in terms of wrapping your head around it. But ATMs and MSBs have been around for a while. Cash intermediaries. We have a Texas bank who struggles with businesses on the border. They have these like Goodwill. I think they call them like ropaterias. They basically sell like clothing and Goodwill kind of stuff, but they're all cash. No one ever uses a credit card. And so because they're all cash, they've had a few incidents where cartel, and they're close to the border, have been able to funnel money and do things through those businesses, right? So, that's one of the things. But actually, I'll tell you one more example. I had a buddy who ran a deli in the 80s, right? And he got a foreign buyer from Vietnam that wanted to buy it. Well, apparently there was this big money laundering issue in Vietnam, and after the war and all these other things. And so there was all this currency that needed to get translated. Well, one of the patterns was these guys would come over and they would buy one of these like food, establishments, and then they would drop the quality or price of. They essentially jack up the numbers to where the price of the food was lower officially, but that was higher on their books, and they would basically money launder all that money back into the U.S. and back into a bank. So those are the kind of patterns that FBI, DEA, we speak to them all the time, are looking for, in general. But without the banks monitoring and doing some of these things and flagging, they would have very little to go on to be able to do it. And I know that sounds unsettling, but that's the nature of where we are, is that these things happen, and they're mostly happening through finances. So cash basis, hiding transactions, those are the breeding grounds for high risk. Totally. No, that makes sense, Justin. Well, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning to come on. As we kind of wrap up, would love to know who would be the best, potential clients to reach out to you at RiskScout. Is there a good contact for folks who want to learn more? Yeah, absolutely. So RiskScout.com, we mostly help financial institutions, so banks and credit unions. Even if you're not currently in an active state, if you want to just ping it, find out about hemp, CBD, any of the other markets, MSBs, ATMs, and so forth. Happy to have a conversation, happy to check over your compliance plan. But really, we're about scaling those systems so you can approach emerging markets, right? We call them high risk, but really they're emerging markets that are being untapped. So RiskScout.com, come and do that. We've got a lot of materials and videos if you're just getting started. I will say, because I think you do have some businesses that come around, if they're looking for a bank, we do have a webpage called Veraleaf.io. So Veraleaf.io. And you can go on there and submit some information to us, and we can help connect you with a good bank. Goes back to that last thing, and it'll be my final soundbite here, is, you want to find a bank who knows what you're doing, is open about it, not a don't ask, don't tell, which is, what a lot of them do, but, an open bank, and then have a good relationship with them. And so if you need help finding a bank like that in your area, we have a lot of them that both use our software, and others we just think are really great banks, and we like to get, businesses over. So that's the ways we can help. Perfect. Well, thanks again, Justin. Really exciting to learn more about RiskScout today. And thanks again for coming on the podcast. Have a great rest of your Friday. Thank you. You too. Take care.